Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be talking about my book, The Nine. What I like to talk about is the journey I went through to discover the story and the research and kind of detective work that got me to writing this book. So it really begins with my great aunt, my tante Hélène Podliasky. I had lunch with her in 2002 with my grandmother. And during that lunch, Hélène was 83 at the time, she told me this story about how she had been deported and then had escaped with a group of women and crossed the front lines of the war in search of the Americans. It was such an astonishing story. I had never heard it before. I don't think she told it to very many people in the family. So I asked her if I could come back and record it, which I did. And I made a transcript. And I thought at the time that we would get together more often and talk about it more often, but, life happened and we never did. The story happened 60 years earlier when she was 23. She was this brilliant mathematician. She was a polyglot. She spoke fluently French and English and German and Russian and Polish, which was very helpful for her in the camps, communicating with the other prisoners, but also with the guards. She had been in the resistance and she was working in Normandy as sort of preparing for the Allied landing. I found out since the publication of the book that she was actually doing much more than I knew. She was traveling around France vetting potential agents and kind of just checking them out and seeing if they could be trusted. She was caught and by the Gestapo and finally deported to Germany in 1944. And then about a year later, she led this escape. So I did this thing with Hélène, I put it aside, and then 2 years later I found this book called Nine Young Girls Who Don't Want to Die, written by Suzanne Maudet, Zaza. And it seemed like it was almost the same story that Hélène had told me. Now, when Hélène had told me her story, she couldn't remember the names of the women she was with, nor how many they were. Some of the details of her story were quite vague. But this account that Zaza wrote, I showed it to Hélène and she said, yes, indeed, that was the same story because Zaza was her friend from high school. And in fact, that they had found each other, they were deported on the same transport and they found each other in Ravensbruck. Zaza wrote her account right after the escape, right after the war. It wasn't published until her death in 2004. In fact, it was 20 years after her death and it was at the insistence of her nephew. But she had this manuscript. I think she tried to get it published. It was rejected. Then it sort of became a manuscript within the family, the story that they told each other. From her book is really this sort of optimistic, fun story, almost like a camping trip. And there's very little clear identification about, or like clear allusion to the camps or the not, what they had just been through. But from her book, I learned the nicknames of all 9 women. I basically learned their nom de guerre, their war names. And in fact, Hélène in the book was called Christine, and that's how she was also known by the Nazis in their records. And I learned that there were 9 women, and that 6 were French, 2 were Dutch, and 1 was Spanish. Many years later, my young daughter, who was around the same age, Sophie, was around the same age as Hélène at the time of the escape. She was struggling a little bit, and I thought we should go on a mother-daughter trip, and I had wanted to write about this escape. I thought I would write an article, an essay, and I thought, well, we'll retrace the route of the escape, my daughter and I, and that will be that. I thought that they had gone to Buchenwald, which was also in Zaza's book and in Hélène's account. It was a kind of a mistake that they made. I had never been to a concentration camp before, nor had Sophie. It was freezing. As you can tell by this photo, it was so upsetting. I realized I didn't know enough to write this story, that I felt like the essay was just wrong, the whole idea that I had. I needed to know more. All I knew were their names. I knew there was Christine, who's Hélène, Zaza, Lon and Gigi were the 2 Dutch women. I knew there was a Nicole, a Minna, Jackie, Zinka, and Jose was the Spanish one. From Buchenwald, Sophie and I went to the Leipzig Memorial Museum. This is in Leipzig where the women were for most of the time. Leipzig was a satellite camp of Buchenwald. It was a slave labor camp. It was a commando, they called them. So what I found out was that the women had been sent to Ravensbrück, and from Ravensbrück, They were selected for their labor. They were young. They were all under 20. The youngest was 20 and the oldest was 29 of the group of 9. And they were selected and sent to Leipzig, Hasag Leipzig slave labor camp, where they lived and worked. And that's where they formed their friendship, their tight-knit group. There was some really beautiful stories I would find out later about the how tight and how carefully they took care of each other. For example, there was this story of the gamelle de solidarité, the bowl of solidarity, where they would pass around a bowl, and everyone would put a spoonful of soup into that bowl, and whoever had the worst day, maybe they'd gotten some bad news, or maybe they'd been beaten, maybe, they were going towards, giving up, they would give that bowl to that person. And it was such a beautiful act. In fact, Juliette Bess, that was in the same block with them, not part of the group, but I read her book. She said that, charity is giving when you can give. Solidarity is giving when you have nothing to give. In Leipzig, they were working at this armament factory to make Panzerfaust, these rocket-held grenade launchers. They were really making the grenades. They worked 12 hours a day, 7 tons per person. They had heavy quotas, lots of injuries. It was really difficult work. That's why they only chose young, healthy women to do it. The thing that Hélène was very proud of and that she told me the most about in her account was that she was able to sabotage this process. Like I said, she was an engineer. She was brilliant. She spoke German. She had befriended one of the guards, Fritz Stupitz. In fact, they became good friends and stayed friends for the rest of their lives. Fritz would try to help her escape, but before then, he put her in charge of the thermostat of the forge, where they were forging these iron shells. And Hélène was able to rewire the thermostat so that in the middle of the forging process, the oven would turn off and it would turn back on near the end, so that the shells did come out looking red hot, but in fact they had been poorly tempered and would explode when used in the face of the soldiers using them. So the factory keeps getting inspected because something's wrong, but never did they suspect that these starving women were capable of this kind of sophisticated sabotage. The factory was also often bombed by the Allies because it was an armaments factory, and it was finally destroyed in the bombardments in April 10 and 11. From that archivist, Mrs. Trebel, she was an incredible archivist, she sent me this list of the Nazi prisoners. This was sort of the first concrete proof, I don't know if that's not quite the right word, or fact that my Tante Hélène was really there. And it was very powerful for me to see her name, Hélène Podliasky, on the list there. Someone has written her name, Hélène, next to it. And just above hers was the name of Suzanne Maudet. It's misspelled, but that's Zaza. And then I found Lon's name further up, Magdalena Verstenian, obviously a Dutch name, so I figured that was her. And then I thought, could this be José, the Spaniard? And then I found Gigi Dandel's. So now I had a few names. I had their whole name, their last name, and I could look further and see where that took me. It was also like for me to discover, it was a big discovery for me about the beauty of archives, because this was an archival document and how that opened up for me a way to find, because I really wanted to figure out who were these women, and what happened to them. So I had this great moment in the archives, because I then signed up to go to the National Archives in Paris. And you have to sign up in advance. You have to choose what you're going to look at in advance and reserve it in advance. And if it's like a needle in the haystack, there's so many possible things to look at. But I chose this one archive of Odette Pilpol just because she was in Leipzig and she was in the same block as them. And I was actually at this point in the search almost about to give up, thinking that there was no way I was going to find anything else. And lo and behold, I get her archive, her dossier, her little box of papers. I pull them out, and the first thing is this list, and it's the original list. The list I got from the archivist in Leipzig was a copy, a fax, and this was the actual original list. And I found this story, which is that Odette stayed behind after the camp had been evacuated by the Nazis. She hid and stayed behind with the sick, even though the rumor was the whole camp was going to be blown up and everyone who stayed behind would be killed. She stayed behind and stole as many Nazi documents as she could, and she stole this list. And this list had permitted so many people, many Polish women, to be identified and their families to find out what happened to them. I mean, it was an incredible gift that she did. She was this born archivist. She had worked in the resistance in Paris in one of the arrondissements. I think it was the 17th, and she had falsified documents, given false papers to Jews, hidden them, done all this work. And when she was in the camp, she did all this work making lists and keeping a record. She was really understood the power of the record and the archive and to bear witness. And so these lists that are on this onion paper from the paper that she found off the factory floor, it's just really quite moving what Odette did. She deserves a book all on her own. And just on the far right is a thing she'd made afterwards. And in the bombing, her friend Anne-Marie Pompanon was killed in the last bombardment. So after everyone leaves, she and her friends bury her. And this is a little map showing where she's buried. And in that file was also a draft of a letter she wrote to Anne-Marie's family to let them know where their daughter was. So as I explained, the factory's bombarded and destroyed, so the women are sent out, but the Nazis gather all the people in the camp, and they're set out on a death march. And this is where Zaza's book begins on April 14th, 1945. This is a period that's really deadly for the survivors of those who had survived the camps. This would be the most deadly period. Over somewhere between 240 to 360,000 people would die on these death marches. As the Nazi army is crumbling and the Russians are coming from the east and the Allies are coming from the west, the Nazi Himmler is trying to empty out these camps. He has this kind of weird idea that maybe they can save these people and they'll use it as collateral for their lives, or they will rebuild the great German army. It's unclear, but there's these death marches all across Europe from all these different camps, and this horrific scenes because, of course, they had no food, they had no water, they've already survived, horrific, maybe 9 months, maybe a year. They're already depleted, and there's mass executions. The women in the group had already received women from Auschwitz in January, Auschwitz death march in January. Some of those women had arrived in Leipzig, and even the women in the block that Hélène was in had taken one in, hidden her, taken off her yellow star and hidden her in their block and learned from her what the death marches were like. So they knew what was ahead of them, and they knew they had only one choice, which was to escape. So I had begun to figure out a little bit more about their trail than I knew with that first trip with my daughter. I knew that they had that they'd been all sent to Ravensbruck. Then they were selected for labor at Leipzig. Then they went on the death march in April. They set off, they paused a little bit in Wurzen. They continued to Oschatz, and there near Oschatz they escaped. And then for 9 days, they traveled across the front lines of the war, looking to find the Americans. They didn't want to be caught by the Russians. And that's the framework I used for my book, those different little villages that they went to and stopped in along the way. But I also knew the archives are one thing, but if I really wanted to find out, I had to try to contact some of the families. I was a bit shy about this. I had the story from my tante Hélène, but what about these other women? Would their families want to talk to me? I realized that most of them, in fact, I found out that all of the women were dead by the time I started doing this work, and I kind of kicked myself that I hadn't started even just a few years earlier. But I wanted to speak with their families. And the first family that I contacted was Zaza's nephew, Pierre Sauvanet, sorry. He and Sophie and I drove to La Rochelle to meet Pierre Sauvanet. He was Zaza's nephew. And he was kind of the one that had kept her manuscript, tried to get it published, and eventually did get it published. In fact, this photograph is him much younger than when I met him. Him with Zaza and René, her husband. And he's showing them the manuscript that he's going to type on this incredible new thing, which is an electric typewriter. So I learned a lot about Zaza's husbands. So both Zaza and René were arrested at the same time. And René was in bomb disposal, which was a terrible job for prisoners. I think 1 in 10 survived. Very traumatic. He never spoke about the war or what happened at all. If Zaza spoke only through her one manuscript that she'd written. And so but her manuscript is so positive and optimistic that I thought this was going to be my happy story. Because they found each other, they went on to have 4 children. So when I asked Pierre about his cousins, Zaza and René's children, he started to cry, and he said, one of his cousins had killed himself, another one had tried to kill herself, but was in an institution. Another one had died in a mental institution of mysterious circumstances, and the fourth was basically barely functional. And so our conversation really became about transgenerational trauma, what that means and why that happens. And it was, for me, a huge discovery. I hadn't really understood it until then. And what was ironic was I met him exactly on the 100th year anniversary of the end of World War I, and which, as you know, World War I really leads directly into World War II, and you kind of see this thread of trauma leading into trauma. It was really powerful for me. I went on to find Madeleine, who's one of the 2 Dutch women, through, in 2010, 2 Dutch filmmakers, Jetske Spanjer and Ange Wieberdink, had made a short documentary about the escape from Lon's point of view and from a book that Lon had written called Ontsnapt, which means escaped. I found out about this. I had kind of vaguely known about this film, but I hadn't really paid attention to it until at this point I'm thinking, wait, Madeleine, there is that movie my aunt told me about, another person in the family. I get a copy of the movie. It's a beautiful documentary, and on my website, there's a link to it. The film ends with a reunion of Lon and Hélène. They hadn't seen each other in 65 years. Both of them would live to almost 100. And they're both in their 90s at this moment. So I knew from the film that Lon had traveled to Paris with her friend Gigi to join her brother Eric, who was in the resistance in Paris, the Dutch network in Paris. But when they get there, that network had already been blown. They didn't know it. They walk right into a trap. They're pretty much arrested by the Gestapo the next day and deported in June. I was able to find Gigi's family, Guillemette Dandel, through a genealogy website. Gigi married another Dutchman, another survivor, who survived Mauthausen. He met her outside the Gestapo interrogation as they were waiting to be interrogated, and he decided that if he survived, he would marry her. She didn't talk to her children very much about what had happened, but she did talk to her grandchildren. This is a common theme. The women wouldn't speak with their direct family, but they would talk to their grandchildren or their nieces or their nephews. It's interesting. Her grandchildren told me that over summers when they would stay with Gigi, because she lived on this beautiful kind of country estate, she would give them episodes of the escape, almost like a comic strip. Gigi stayed friends with Mena, and so through Gigi, I was able to find Mena, who was Yvonne Le Gouillou. And Mena had chosen that nom de guerre because it was an artist that she liked. I was able to interview Mena's son-in-law and grandson. They were lovely. She was born in Brittany. She grew up really working class girl in Paris. And actually, this is the kind of interesting part for me of this story. This group of 9 women are really different. They're from different socioeconomic. Gigi was practically Dutch nobility, and Mena is working class. Some of them were Gaullists, some of them were communists, some of them were socialists, some of them were apolitical like Mena. She said she had joined the resistance because she was in love with this boy. Some of them, they had all different kind of political, all different kind of economic, they came from all parts of France and even Spain and Holland, and yet they formed this friendship in this tight-knit group. They were able to, they weren't polarized in their beliefs or ideology. I love Mena. She seems to have loved being in love. She's sort of a flirt. She didn't talk about the war except with her daughter, who also died young. They both died young. But she made a quilt for her daughter, and then later, from the coat that she had worn during the escape, and then she later made a little bunny rabbit for her grandson. So now I thought, I need to go back to Germany because I know so much more than I did before. And I went with an association, nonprofit for Buchenwald, Dora Mittelbau, and the Commandos. So this was a group formed by survivors after the war. There were a bunch of these, most of them started by women who came back to Paris and found there was no real support for them, and they created a support group for themselves. So they would help each other find jobs and apartments, and they would help each other through illnesses, and they could talk to each other. And now these associations continue for descendants of the victims and survivors, and their mission is to kind of keep the history, the memory, the archive, the witness testimonies, and to maintain the camps as memorial sites. This group goes every year to Buchenwald on the anniversary of the liberation, because Buchenwald is the one camp that the prisoners actually liberated themselves. This was an amazing trip to go on with all these different children of survivors. And from one of the members of the association, I got a contact to find Nicole's daughter, and she was wonderful and gave me unpublished writings by her mother. So Nicole is Nicole Clarence. She wrote an article for Elle magazine where she was an editor in 1965 on the anniversary of her liberation. And then she got all this hate letters back saying, "How dare you write about this? We're not talking about this. We've gone on. Let's forget about the past. This is too painful." She was basically told to shut up. Nicole was one of the 2 Jewish people in the group. So all of the group of 9 were resistance, were arrested for their resistance work. Nicole and my tante Hélène were both Jewish, but this was something that they kept quiet and that the Germans didn't know. This was probably why they were able to survive. They were arrested as political prisoners and treated as political prisoners and not as Jewish prisoners. Nicole joined the resistance really young, as most of these women did, and she was arrested only after her 21st birthday. But she was incredibly important by that time. She was in charge of she was the agent de liaison, the liaison agent for all the resistance networks in the Paris region at the age of 21. She was taken to a Gestapo black site called Rue de la Pompe, which was a notorious, terrible place. Even the Gestapo had a black site, which tells you a lot. An extra-legal place where they run by criminal underground characters, really awful, sadistic people, where she was very badly tortured. The tragedy for Nicole as well was that this is August 1944, and the Allies are bombing on the outskirts of Paris. I mean, Paris is just about to be liberated. She thinks at any moment she's going to be freed. And instead, she's put on the very last transport out of Paris, just as the city was being liberated. She's one of the 57,000, they're called. And they're called that because when they arrive in Ravensbruck from this last transport, their number will start with 57. There were about 2,000 of them in that transport. In 1996, I discovered Nicole recorded 2.5 hours of oral history, which I was able to access at the American University of Paris, that has a genocide research center, which is in partnership with the USC Shoah Foundation's Visual Archive. From then, I was able to find Jackie, because Jackie was also one of the 57,000. And I found her on one of the lists that Odette Pilpol had written, but also through Nicole's oral history. And Jackie was a war widow. She had diphtheria. She's the oldest in the group. She's 29. She had diphtheria during the entire escape. After the war, she married Charles Feld, who was a famous resistance hero. And so he was the one that everyone talked about. When I spoke to her colleagues, because she was a film editor, they didn't know that she had ever been in the resistance, that she had ever been deported, that she had escaped, nothing. She never talked about it. She's quite a salty one. She's a great character of the 9. I was able to find José Bordanava. She's the Spaniard of the group. She's the youngest. I was able to confirm that this José Bordanava was the Spanish person in the group. She was known for her beautiful singing voice. She was raised in foster care. I think she was in the resistance very young, because that foster care house was famous for hiding Jewish children. She was arrested in March. She was on the same transport as Gigi and Lon. married briefly. This is the one person I wasn't able to speak to her family. I wasn't able to, she had no children. And I know the least about José. She's kind of the one that is still has a big question mark in the group for me. I know about her only from the others talking about her, but not really from her own family. So I did a third trip with my sister to Germany because I knew I had to see Ravensbrück. Ravensbrück is the second largest concentration camp after Auschwitz-Birkenau. It was a camp built only for women, and most women prisoners deported to Germany passed through this camp, either through Ravensbrück and Auschwitz, or they would come to Ravensbrück and then go to Auschwitz, and sometimes from Auschwitz they would come back to Ravensbrück. It's the capital of crimes against women. What happened to women there is appalling, and it's 50 miles north of Berlin, 90 minutes north of Berlin, and it's a central part of their story. So I needed to see that place, and I needed to learn about it. One of the things about Ravensbrück is that because it was so close to Berlin and it was on German soil, more than any other camp, the Nazis wanted to hide it. And all of the records were destroyed and burned before it was liberated by the Red Army in April. It is one of the camps that there was the least about after the war, and it kind of made it easy to forget it. In fact, the history of this site is really important to the story. It was flattened by Soviet tanks 3 years afterwards, and Ravensbrück really became marginalized. It was in East Germany, and because it was a camp for women, it didn't seem to be important. They were going to build a shopping mall, and then some of the communist survivors fought to keep it as a kind of a shrine in the struggle against fascism, because many of you know, I'm sure, that there's this clear divide between the Soviet communists who felt that Hitler and fascism was the ultimate end of capitalism in the West and imperialism. And so they saw this clear divide, whereas others would see these two totalitarian states as being sort of the same. The deaths of Jews and gypsies and so-called asocials were completely ignored from the history. So lesbians, prostitutes, any kind of sort of marginal person, those were never in the archive. We don't even know their names. And many of the women who survived returned to their countries and didn't speak about the camp. It was shameful. Like, as I said, with Nicole wrote her article, it was unspeakable. There was a stigma. Marriages were called off. You didn't talk about it. The final person in the 9 that I was able to discover, and which was one of the more moving moments for me in the research, was this person, Zinka, René Lebon. Zinka joined the resistance earlier than the others. She came from a family who was really close to de Gaulle. All of them were in the resistance. Her brother died in Bir Hakeim. Her other brother and sister were in the camps. Zinka was arrested pregnant, and so she wasn't deported right away, because in France at the time they wouldn't deport a pregnant woman because the baby was considered innocent. So after she gave birth to her baby girl, whom she named France, and the baby was taken away from her, she was sent to the camps. She caught TB in the camps. She was sick and very sick for the rest of her life. And, since the beginning of this project, I was thinking, France has got to be alive. She was born in 1944. There's a good chance she's still alive. I really wanted to find baby France. It's hard to find someone named France Le Bon in France, because it's almost like Joe Smith as a name. But a bunch of reasons came together, and I was able to find her. This is France there. She doesn't live that far from where I live. When we found each other, we kind of fell into each other's arms and started to cry. And I said, you wouldn't believe how long I've been looking for you. And she said, well, imagine for me to learn all of this about my mother at the age of 70. She had known her mother after the war, but her mother had been sick, and so she had been cared for by other members of her family, and her mother never talked about what had happened. She had no idea what her mother had gone through, nor the role that she played in saving her mother's life, or how much it mattered to her mother to see her. And so she had only understood her mother as kind of an abandonment. So she and I spent a lot of time talking, and she went into her attic and found papers that she'd never looked at. And one of those was a manuscript about the escape, which was incredibly helpful to me in the book. And it just made me understand why it's important to tell these stories. After the war, women kept quiet about their role in the resistance. De Gaulle asked the women to step back and let the men take the glory. He said they had been so badly humiliated already. women got the right to vote in France in 1945, so that should be enough for them. De Gaulle named 138 compagnons de la libération, and of those, 6 were women and 4 were already dead, even though probably the resistance was at least 50% run by women. Women really just shut up about their role. But as the women got older, they realized that they would be forgotten. But more importantly, the women who had died, who had done incredible things, would be forgotten, and they began to speak up. So this is the story of my book, The Nine. It's really about how the women, what they did in the resistance, how they befriended each other, the kind of acts of solidarity they did to survive, how they escaped, and then what happened to them after liberation, and why it takes 60 years for them to start to tell their stories. And I'm really happy now to take your questions. And thank you for listening. Oh, I have to unmute. Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Perfect.
Is that beautiful Provençal sunshine
Yeah, we've
flooding
got a
your
beautiful,
office?
gorgeous spring day. It's actually
Where,
afternoon here. Yeah.
where are you exactly?
I'm in the south of France where I live, in about equidistance between Marseille and Avignon.
Oh, beautiful.
Mm.
Wow.
Yeah, it's really
Um,
nice.
so we have a couple of essays in terms of questions already here. So
Okay.
obviously we provoked a great reaction, but I have a broader question for you.
Uh-huh.
Uh, what difference did the French resistance actually make? And I'm going to add another question to that.
That's a good
Can
one.
you estimate what percentage of the French population actually belonged to the French resistance?
Yeah, okay. Both of those are really good questions. And I'm not an expert on the resistance, but I would say in terms of what percentage, I think it grew like everything else in the beginning of the
Yeah.
war, very few. And and I don't think it was ever a substantial amount, in fact. And I think that at the very beginning, the crimes that if you were arrested for working in the resistance, you were a terrorist. That was the crime. And I think and it often brought terrible things on your family and everybody. So it was really some survivors were completely chastised by their family when they returned. Like, look at what you did. Like, look at the danger you put us in. How dare you do that? And I even heard this incredibly moving story of a family that discovered only on the deathbed of their grandfather that he had been hiding Jewish children in the woods. He'd kept it hidden, and then when they found out, he apologized to them because he said he realized he had risked their lives by doing that. So I think it was really looked down on. I think in general, it wasn't something, I can't do a number. I don't know how many, but much fewer than claimed at the end of the war were in the resistance. I'd put it that way, you
Yeah,
know.
'cause it's kind of interesting because, in the sort of 50s, 60s, 70s, you had this irony that everybody in France that was
Yeah,
asked by a foreigner, they always said, "Oh, my uncle or my dad or
yeah,
my whole family, we're all in the resistance," when in fact a disturbing amount of people actually collaborated.
absolutely.
Those who were going to benefit economically collaborated the most, obviously, Henri Renault being a perfect
Mhm.
example.
Yeah, and
So,
I think it was also, yeah, it was, it was scary. It was, I think, to be in the resistance was really dangerous. I mean, all the women that were in the resistance in my group lasted really almost no more than a year. It
right.
wasn't, and they were pretty amateurish and they got caught a lot. So I think yeah, I think there was a lot fewer, and the French, the collaboration, a lot of the collaborators, as in Germany, the big companies that use slave labor, they all got away with it. The people that got blamed were of course, the women who slept with German soldiers.
Right. So what's hard for me to understand is that, you've belonged to the resistance. You've done the exceptional thing. You're part of the less than 1% of French people who actively put their lives on the line,
Mhm.
not wearing a uniform to oppose enormous evil. And yet you feel shameful. Was that because of the way that they were humiliated and debased in Ravensbrück at the hands of the Nazis? Or was it because they reminded other French people of how little they did themselves? They induced guilt in other French people.
That's a good question. I think really at the base of it is French. France after the war was still very much of a Catholic country. And the idea that if you survived as a woman, if you survived Ravensbruck, it meant you were a prostitute. You had slept, you'd have been raped, or you had slept with German soldiers. Somehow you had survived. Like there was a kind of stigma that was sexualized for women in a way that wasn't for men who had survived the camps. So, and that had to be with a kind of like a sort of Catholic purity sort of idea. It's hard to also, after the war, it happened in the States as well. There was a kind of a swing back to conservatism. Like, before the war in the 20s and 30s, there was this kind of progressive movement in Europe and in the States. And there was, in Germany, there was the Weimar Republic. There was this kind of more openness about different ways of being. And then I think after the war, there's really this movement back. And I think those kind of women who did those kind of things represented like, no, women are not like that. Women stay in the house. They're homemakers or housewives, or, I think that's in my mind, but this is just my opinion. Obviously it's much more complicated.
Yeah, so they were useful while we needed them, but then the patriarchy returned and said, keep quiet, go
Yeah.
back in the kitchen. Thanks a lot. But,
Yeah, and I just want to add that the letter that was written to Nicole, the one that I read that was so violently critical of her, was by another survivor.
wow.
Yeah.
So we have a friend from Thai, actually Thai friend, and he says, can you please talk more about the resistance activities undertaken by the women you have researched? And then he adds, and you can read this, the sabotage by your great aunt was ingenious. So can
Yeah.
you add a little bit about their daring do and their activities?
Yeah, each one was different, and some of them did almost nothing because, like I said, Lon and Gigi were arrested pretty much the day they joined. Um, so Zinka's family was really like a serious resistance family from the get-go. Her father was very close to General de Gaulle, and she was part of the network that helped down pilots. They would hide them and then try to get them to Spain. So she had these funny stories about these trying to like move around Paris with these huge American pilots and try to make them look like they were French. So that was what she was doing. Nicole talked a lot about it was hard to find the resistance. That was one of the biggest problems she had. She knew she wanted to fight, but she didn't know how to. So it took her a while, and she would be in one group, and that group would get destroyed, and she'd kind of escape. But in the end, she was working. An agent de liaison is basically the person that connects the different groups, that brings messages between. So the different groups didn't know each other. That was partly to save them from, they wouldn't in torture tell about another group. So the agent de liaisons were the ones who actually knew where all the different groups were and would get information to them and get messages then to them, and that kind of, it's a very dangerous job. And in fact, that's why she was in the end caught. Jackie was working. She was like the right-hand man of Brutus, the guy. I'm trying to think of his name. It was a network in Lyon and then up in Paris. Hélène was working in Normandy. She was part of working with the BOA. She would create what she told me about was that she helped get the message and then set up the landing sites for these little plane like parachute drops of our small arms and sabotage stuff all throughout the Normandy region. But she was also traveling all around France. I found out later, vetting potential people. Who else have I not talked about? That's Nicole. After this, but they were all doing different things. They were all in different networks. And they sometimes, I think Nicole was in 3 different networks. Like she had to switch. The leader of her network was caught, who she was very close to, that kind of thing. So they had to move from place to place and that kind of thing.
So we have I think everybody should, if they're not looking at the chat stream, this is like, it's like studying for a PhD in.
At the same time? Yeah, okay.
We have some really awesome statements as well as questions. Yeah. Then Kathy Lecomte brings up a really interesting point about transgenerational trauma. Mm-hmm. Did you see examples of that in the people that you interviewed when you were talking about their grandmothers or grandaunts, etc.?
Absolutely. In fact, that became a kind of theme of the book, which was unexpected, and even in my own family. Made a lot of things fall into place that I hadn't realized. Because also my grandfather was also, he was in the OSS, And so it made me understand a lot more about my father and, um, so I would say that every single family that I interviewed talked about it, that there was a way that it had affected. And some concrete examples I can give you is one of the things that they say about children of the survivors and the generation, even grandchildren, is that there's a high percentage of them that work as in like sort of trying to save the world sort of jobs, like emergency room doctors, or my Hélène's daughter runs a homeless shelter. There's that kind of thing that I saw again and again amongst the children, the generations later. Another one was Zinka's son and his grandson, and her grandson met me for lunch, and her son explained to me that he was anorexic. He became anorexic because his mother had weird issues around food, and she herself had been anorexic after the war. And then his son was there, and his son is a chef, and his son said, I'm just trying to feed my family. Like, you could just see this, and of course I told you the story of Zaza's family, which was really heartbreaking. But yes, it's incredibly mysterious in a sort of way. Like, you think it's kind of like a haunting or something. And I'm not quite sure what the answer is, but partly I think it's telling the stories a lot. I spoke with Lon had twins, and I spoke with one of her daughters, and Lon was a very difficult mother, a very traumatized and complicated mother to have. And the daughter said, when Lon finally wrote her book, she was 80 years old, that's when she felt like she could finally have a relationship with her mother. Her mother calmed down, but before then she was highly paranoid, quick to anger, all the kind of symptoms that affected, of course, her. That's her mother, so that affected her childhood.
So us British, us Limeys, we always like to think that we wouldn't have behaved like the French,
Uh-huh.
the cowardly French, the frogs that basically bent over and allowed their
Yeah.
country to be occupied for 4 years. And we wouldn't have behaved like the Dutch or anybody else that was occupied in World War II. But the only thing that separated us from their fate was 23 miles of the English Channel. Your study, what did it tell you about how most people react to conquest and terror and being under the Nazi jackboot? Was every culture the same? Would we have been the same as British? Would the Americans have behaved the same if?
I mean, I think so. I
Right.
think so. I think that even one of the things my grandmother, my Hélène, my aunt, insisted on when she was telling me the story was that not all Germans were bad. There were Germans that were trying to help her. There were Germans that, well, you see it in the story of the escape, which I don't go into because, you got to read the book, but in the women.
You're not allowed to say that. You're not allowed to say you have to read the book because, some of us do and some of us don't. So you have to tell us.
Okay. Well, the women meet these different characters along the way as they're trying to escape. And from each village, it's always very dangerous. They have to figure out, what risks to take and who they can trust and who they can. And sometimes they almost get recaptured, etc. And sometimes they meet genuinely nice German people who really want to help them and are absolutely moved to tears by what they have been through. And sometimes they meet families who obviously sense that the war is going in another direction and are saying, like, you remember what we did for you. Yeah, you'll tell them what we did for you because they were probably terrible to, they've had prisoners or whatever. So I think, there's no, human nature is complicated and yeah, it does. I don't think it matters what country you're from. I do think that the Americans have the advantage that it wasn't on our continent, it wasn't on our soil. And to understand the French, they were really badly led. They were let down by their old military that was arrogant and thought that they were fine, and then just basically didn't listen to all the warnings of what was happening next door in Germany. So in the German soldiers, the foot soldiers suffered just as terribly, and the German people were very scared, and the French soldiers were anyway. Yeah, I'm just rambling on, but so go.
But
Sorry.
I posted in the chat a photograph of a particularly interesting Gestapo officer.
Mm.
You might recognize him. That's Helmut Nocken.
Uh-huh.
So
Oh, okay.
he has a PhD in medieval English literature. This
No, I
guy
know.
can speak 5 languages. He was 36 years old. He was head of the French
Mm.
Gestapo. basically the
Terrible.
Uber boss. He ran all of France by the
Yeah.
1944. He was the one that ordered the deportations of everybody,
Mm.
or was in control of the deportations of everybody
Mm.
you've written about. How do we have a so-called aesthete like this become so evil?
Look, Milosevic was a Shakespeare expert, remember? And I don't think
I do know that at Wannsee, when they organized the
yeah,
final solution of the committee of the 11, eight
mm,
had PhDs. So,
yeah.
maybe we shouldn't have people having PhDs
Yeah, maybe
anymore.
that's the problem right there.
Again, beware the academic. But anyway,
Yeah, I agree. I hear you. I know what you mean. It's in another way that what's sort of, you think about Germany before the war, before the rise of Hitler, it was like this incredible culture, right? It was like the Enlightenment. It was all this incredible stuff had come out of Germany and was, you know, but you have I think in moments of chaos and confusion, when people are afraid, their worst instincts come out. And also there are people who love power and yeah, I mean this idea of racial purity or racial superiority that continues to this day. It's not something that's gone away.
so there's another photograph there, which is of women working in the winter
Yeah,
of 1944, 45
that's in
in Ravensbruck.
Ravensbruck. Yeah.
I think in the Guinness Book of Records or somewhere I read that it's the largest prison, so-called prison for women in history.
Mhm.
Um, the photograph below it is of Toquette Jackson, and I don't know whether you know, but I wrote a book called Avenue of Spies, which is about the Jackson family, an American family that
Oh,
lived on Avenue Foch in Paris. And that's actually Toquette Jackson, who was married. She's on the far right there in the photographs, and that's
wow.
she was married to an American doctor, Sumner Jackson, head of the American hospital in Paris. So
Wow.
as I was reading your book, there was many places where I kept thinking about the
Mhm.
narrative that I had written about resistance, etc. That's a photograph of Toquette Jackson taken in April of 1945, and she was the oldest of the women who were in that last deportation from
Mhm.
Paris that you talk about. Now, that last deportation, those were the resistance, la crème de la crème of the resistance. These were the
Mhm.
bravest of the brave, the ones that were most important. And she was 56 years old in that photograph, and she was the
Mhm.
oldest by a decade to survive Ravensbrück. The fact that
Mhm.
could get into your 50s and survive a winter in Ravensbrück was a
Yeah.
miracle.
Yeah, and in fact those were some of the coldest winters on record. And they were, I know in 1945, and they were definitely selecting any women that had gray hair would be immediately gassed. They would be taken to the youth camp just next door, the Onkamak. I know that like Germaine Tillon's mother was killed that way. And it's you're so close to the end of the war, and it's so deadly. I mean, it's really kind of this. It's the most dangerous time. I would love to read your book. That's so fascinating.
Well,
Um,
another thing that I was amazed by was that the last deportation was particularly tragic because, as you pointed out, you could literally hear the sound of liberation of the Allied
yeah.
artillery. And it was a very hot day, that August day, 15th of
Mhm.
August, 1944. And in one compartment, you had a group of really amazing women, which included our most famous and celebrated
Right,
SOE,
Bennett. Yeah,
Felix Arbert, I
yeah,
posted there. And
beautiful.
then the woman below, for those of us who are, thinking about the US, particularly right now, there's another woman below. That's Virginia de Albert Lake, who's an American member
Hmm.
of the French resistance. So these women were all placed in one boxcar.
Hmm.
Boxcar had a metal roof, and they were naked.
Mm.
Some Many of them were naked, and I read accounts where they would kneel down and they would lick the drips of sweat coming
Mm.
off the woman in front of them, and their bodies were so tightly packed that they
Mm.
would squirm like fish in a
Mm.
tank because they were
Yeah.
hot.
Mm.
So
Awful.
incredible scenes. I want to
Yeah,
ask
terrible.
you about what you learned about human nature, because I think that this always poses questions about, you know,
Mm.
why were these women, why were they so exceptional? What was it about them? They were very diverse, but What did they have in their hearts and souls that made them so brave?
Mm. I asked my aunt that question because I said, why did you join the resistance? Why did you do this? And she said, well, I just because it was the right thing to do. It's kind of this mysterious answer. What I think also makes them later exceptional in the camp and surviving, I feel like, was how they helped each other. Um, to me, these sort of the solidarity and the friendships and these kind of tight groups that helped each other, that's really moving. So yes, on the one hand, there's this kind of, we know how terrible the camps were. We know the horrific things that sort of sadistic SS did. We know, but there's also, I think the reason these stories continue to fascinate us is because in amongst that, there's also these amazing stories of light and hope and incredible, I don't want to be like Pollyanna about it, but incredible acts of bravery by just ordinary people. I don't know why some people stand up and say, no, this will not stand, and others go along with, the crowd just to get to save their, try to duck their head and just keep going. I'm not quite sure what makes that difference, but I do think that in order to survive, and many of the people said that the bravest of the brave did not survive. They died in the camp, but the ones that helped each other, they had a chance. And then and also everything it depended, like when you arrived, what languages you spoke, who you met, what networks you could plug into. There were 1,000 camps within every camp. Ravensbruck was enormous. It's the second largest camp after Auschwitz-Birkenau. It's a huge camp. And there were all kinds of hierarchies and powers, and you had a better chance of surviving if you knew certain people that had access to food or could get you a good job and not a labor intensive job. So all that stuff plays into how, what makes these people, how they survive or not. But why someone is an extraordinary person, I don't know. I wish I did.
Well, your book gets us to ask those questions, which is really important. And I wanted to thank you on behalf of Friends for joining us from
Thank you.
beautiful France. I love where you live. Thank you
Uh,
for your time. Thank you for a wonderful book. We had a
yeah,
really great reaction to your talk, and I hope
yeah.
you'll join us again.
Well, thank you for your questions. It's great. I love talking about that, and I love hearing about your book. Really, really, it's endlessly fascinating, this period of
Yeah.
history. It really is.
Well, you've joined us at a great time because we didn't do this consciously, but this happens to be Women's History Month in the
Yeah,
US.
yeah.
So I didn't realize that until just this morning, actually. So thank you for being a
Okay.
part of our Women's History Month.